Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Thompson, and I'm Vice-Chancellor here at the Royal College of Art. It gives me real pleasure to introduce RCA alumnus, fashion designer, and prize-winning novelist, Douglas Stuart. Douglas is kindly joining us today from New York, which has been his home for the past 20 years. Douglas, good morning and welcome back.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And huge congratulations for winning the 2020 Booker Prize for your debut novel, Shuggie Bain. Now, off the top of my head, I think you are only the second novelist to come out of the RCA, the last one being Len Dighton in 1955, who this year celebrates his 91st birthday. Certainly in my memory, I can't remember a Booker winner receiving such warm adulation and such widespread media coverage as Shuggie Bain. In part, I guess, because it was only the second time in its 50-year history that the Booker has been won by a Scotsman. Let me begin by telling our audience a little bit about you. You studied textiles as an undergraduate at Galashiels College, part of Heriot-Watt University, while also working jobs at night and weekends to support yourself. You then won a place here at the Royal College of Art to study menswear and textiles under Professor Wendy Dagworthy. It's a remarkable achievement in its own right, but all the more remarkable when you considered against the traumatic experience you suffered of losing your mother to addiction when you were just 16 years old. Douglas graduated from the RCA in 2000, alongside other notable alumni, the photographer Alison Jackson and fellow fashion designer Alice Temperley. He was snapped up immediately by talent scouts from Calvin Klein at his graduation show and moved to New York, where he's lived ever since. Sarah Dallas, senior tutor in knitwear, was his personal tutor at the RCA. Now, this may feel a little bit like Eamon Andrews' This Is Your Life if you're young enough or old enough to remember, because I'm going to recount what Sarah Dallas, who may be on this webinar now, remembers of you. Douglas was an extremely committed student, quietly ambitious and very technically knowledgeable. She recalls being impressed by Douglas's drive and admired the fact that he had got himself a place at the RCA through sheer hard work and resilience. That work ethic stayed with him throughout his MA and has very clearly served him well in his professional life. He's since worked as a senior designer at luxury fashion houses, including Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, before taking the personal decision to direct his talent more towards accessible brands such as Gap and Banana Republic. He went on to become Vice President of Design and Brand Strategy at Jack Spade, but in 2017, the urge to express his creativity through words became too strong and he left the world of fashion. Shuggie Bain took 10 years to write and a subsequent 2 years and 32 attempts before finding a publisher, Picador. It was written at weekends and during snatched moments before and after the day job. Douglas's second novel, Loch Awe, has already been completed and his third is currently well underway. You are on a roll, Douglas. Although Shuggie Bain is work of fiction, it's also a very personal story. As the youngest in his family, Douglas grew up living in Sighthill in the East End of Glasgow. He's been quoted as saying that it was his English and art teachers at school who awakened and encouraged a love for art and literature in him. When his English teacher lent him a novel at the age of 17, it was the first book he had ever read other than a school textbook. And so to a brief description of the novel. Shuggie Bain is set within a divided world of Catholic versus Protestant, of grinding poverty, a broken mining community with characters manipulated and manipulating in a desperate attempt to survive. From reading the very first pages, I was struck by the vivid visual beauty of your prose. And as I finished the first chapter, my literary sat-nav started to whir, trying to locate this genre of writing. I think Shuggie's a landmark novel, as remarkable as Sheila Donnelly's Taste of Honey from the 1950s, Barry Hines' A Kestrel for a Knave from the 60s, and most recently that other debut novel by a gay working-class French writer, Edouard Louis, The End of Eddie, published in 2014. Can I ask you now, Douglas, to read the first of two passages you've kindly selected for us?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me tonight. It's good to see the Darwin building behind you, Paul.
It really is.
It takes me back. It takes me back. But the first passage actually comes from the beginning of the book. The heroine of the book is Agnes Bain, who is the proud working class mother of the Bain family. She is a beautiful, gregarious, generous, funny, determined woman. And here we see her having a Friday night card party with her friends, and she's chafing at the smallness of her life. Here are the women of Sighthill having a card party. The women cackled without breaking their concentration on the cards. It was sweaty and close in the front room. Agnes watched her mammy, little Lizzie, carefully studying her hand, flanked by the bulk of Nan Flanagan on one side and Reenie Sweeney on the other. The women sat thigh to thigh and tore at the last scraps of a fish supper. They were moving coins and folding cards with greasy fingers. Anne-Marie Easton, the youngest amongst them, was concentrating on rolling mean-looking cigarettes of loose tobacco on her skirt. The women spilt their housekeeping money on the low tea table and were pushing 5 and 10 pence bets back and forward. It bored Agnes. There was a time before baggy cardigans and skinny husbands that she had led them all up the dancing. As girls, they had clung to one another like a string of pearls and sang at the top of their voices all the way down Sucky Hall Street. They had been underage, but Agnes, sure of herself even at 15, knew she would get them in. The doorman always saw her gleaming at the back of the line and beckoned her forward, and she pulled the other girls behind her like a chain gang. They held on to the belt of her coat and muttered protest, but Agnes just smiled her best smile for the doorman, the smile she kept for men, the same smile she hid from her mother. She had loved to show off her new teeth back then. She got her teeth from her daddy's side, and the original Campbell teeth had always been weak. They were a reason for humility in an otherwise handsome face. Her own adult teeth had come in small and crooked, and even when they were new, they had never been white because of the smoking and her mammy's strong tea. At 15, she had begged Lizzie to let her have them all taken out. The discomfort of the false teeth was nothing when compared to the movie star smile she thought they must give her. Each tooth was broad and even and as straight as Elizabeth Taylor's. Agnes sucked at her porcelain. Now here they were, every Friday night, these same women playing cards in her mammy's front room. There was not a single drop of makeup between them. Nobody had much of a heart to sing anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Before turning to our students, I wondered if I could ask a couple of questions myself. Shuggie and his mother both construct facades. You know, he tries to walk like his older brother to mask his difference from other children, and Agnes pays a special attention to her appearance, her Liz Taylor looks. She talks in a loud voice about rump steak for dinner, as if she had both the means and the intention of feeding her children well. Can you tell us more about the masks and the facades your characters construct?
Yes, I think at the heart of it, it is a conversation about pride and self-worth and shame. Here are two characters who are going through not only a tough time, but it's a collective tough time. I mean, Thatcher had sort of decimated Glaswegian industry, and unemployment went to about 26% in the city and stayed there for a generation. So the tough time that the Bain family are experiencing in the novel is shared by many other families across the housing estates across the city. But Agnes Bain will never leave the front door without both having her best coat on, having her hair done, having her makeup freshly applied, but also affecting standard English when she goes out and engages with all of these Glaswegians. And in a way, that is both her sense of self-worth and her pride, but it's also her dreams and her hopes for a better tomorrow. It's something that isolates her from the other women and the other families around her, because of course they understand when you live in a council house and wages are the same or there are no wages, then everything is very standardized. And so her deciding to do that is a very bold move to sort of set herself aside and almost declare herself as better than others. Shuggie, on the other hand, is trying to be on the inside. He is infected with his mother's pride, and he is a young, precocious, effeminate boy who very quickly in the novel is told he's no right or not the same as all the other boys around him. He's othered very quickly in the book because there's a very narrow way that masculinity is allowed to show itself in some of these working class communities, and he is so far outside of it. So he spends much of the book trying to construct a facade where he is like the other boys. He is taught how to walk like a man, how to carry his genitals inside his trousers, the way straight men should. And then he also dedicates an awful lot of his reading time to studying an old, out-of-date football scorebook, almost like it's the rosary. And if he can just memorize these Premier League scores, then that will sort of make him heterosexual, I suppose. So they're both working different facades.
It's just so pitiful. And I think what's also so awful is the fact that it's a veil that people see through. That taxi car mechanic sees through the veil. You can see an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And the other taxi driver who rapes her sees exactly through the veil. And all the school children completely see through the facade that Shuggie has created. And it's all the more pitiful, I think, because of the transparency of the attempts that they make. One of the things that really struck me is that the novel never rages. There's no anger, or doesn't seem to be any anger from you, and it's not at all maudlin. How do you manage to set the thermostat so precisely and so beautifully in terms of that?
Well, I think the book is about love. It's about many different types of love. The love is often tested. It's about the love that children have with flawed parents, that very tenacious, all-forgiving, unconditional love. And then it's about a woman's journey, or sort of, she's looking for love too. She's looking to find someone who loves her as much as she loves herself. And it's about how all that love is tested many, many times. But the truth is when people read the book, they bring their own lenses to it. And when you grow up in that world and you're of it, it doesn't feel grim or pitiful or that. It's just life. And so as a writer, my entire service is spent in service to the characters and not necessarily in service to readers who might never have been inside these housing schemes or these estates in Glasgow, because I can't control that. Whatever you bring to the book is your own sort of lens that you drop over it. And so it's easy to write about humanity if you come to the page with a respect for the characters, even when they're doing desperate things or they're acting in a way that you know is going to be against their better nature. Or now, as a middle-class man living in New York, I would think, God, that's not a great thing to do. But it is important for those characters. And so you just write about it with as clear an eye as you can, as descriptively as you can, and from the character's point of view. When I wrote the book, I had no idea that it would be published. I actually had no desire for it to be published. That wasn't the reason why I wrote it. Certainly not to go on and win the Booker. That's nothing I could ever have dreamt of.
Yeah.
And so everything about the book is in service to creating this world and making it as immersive and as truthful and as ugly as it was at times, but telling that as plainly as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in another a colleague from the RCA, if I may. He's a wonderful artist and writer, and he leads our writing program. He's called Jeremy Miller. He leads the writing program, the master's writing program, and also teaches on our contemporary art practice program. And Jeremy, I know, has got some questions he'd like to ask you, and then we'll open it up to the wider audience. So, Jeremy.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Douglas. Yeah, we have some questions from some alums and from some current students as well. So I guess just to say to the rest of the audience, I'm afraid that the chat and the raise hand functions aren't working for you. I'm in a very lucky position now, Douglas, to be able to ask you the first question now. This is my my privilege. I just wondered if you could say a little more about, you touched on it just now, but one of the themes running throughout the book is this difference between the appearance of things and the reality of things, really. And I just wonder if you could just say a little more about the importance of that for you, please.
Yeah, I think it comes back to a sense of poverty. And sometimes, you know, when you don't have the comfort of money, there's not much you can bring into a situation. other than the body sometimes. And the body sort of extends itself into how that appears and how you carry yourself in the world. And the dignity which you want to be seen. You know, I think living in poverty, we tend as a society to heap shame on it or think it's a bad thing. But actually there's as much dignity there as anything. And it just means life is harder, or you have to work harder. And so the appearance of things for the characters in the book is really important, especially for Agnes, because she's defiant in that way. And it has disastrous consequences for her, because Paul is right, it's a very thin veneer of pride, but people also see through it and it isolates her. But it's something she has control over. And it's also a comment on what we allowed women to have control over in working class societies in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And how they looked and how they presented themselves had an outweighed sort of proportion to that, I suppose, is what you would say. But appearance is really important. And I think also, we'll probably talk about it later, comes from my experience as in visual arts first.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as you say, we've got some great questions coming up. So I'm going to introduce the first one. It's from Sarah Fretwell-Jerks, who I think is just about to join us. So Sarah is an alum from graphic art and design in 1987. I hope he's coming to the screen now. I think she studied graphic design at Leicester before joining us. Here she is. Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you, Douglas, and you, Jeremy. My question is, I trained as a designer myself at the RCA and started writing about 8 years ago. And I just wondered what inspired you to start writing?
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I think, first of all, a love of reading. There was so many sort of small indications in my life. When I was a young boy, I had a huge love for books when they came into my life at 17. But by then it was too late for me to follow academia or to follow English as a career. And so I was encouraged, and I'm so grateful that I was encouraged, into textiles, which then blossomed into the Royal College and took me to New York. But I always, in my heart, even through textiles and fashion, the thing that attracts me to it is the storytelling potential of it, the research, the way you can pull different narratives together and create something totally new and create these worlds. And so for me, there's a similarity between them in that way, although they're very different mediums. But I'd always wanted to write, and so I sat down to begin writing Shuggie, not knowing it was going to be a novel, about 10 years ago, actually at the peak of my fashion career, when I was busiest and I was most successful. But I was still unfulfilled, and there was a thing also in fashion that was happening. It wasn't that fashion designers were losing their ability to tell stories. It was the world couldn't hear them as much anymore because information was coming quicker and we were digesting images and things and then tossing them away so much faster. And so fashion was becoming less fulfilling for me as well, as a way to sort of express myself. And so I sat, after spending all this time in a very dynamic, instinctual, collaborative industry, in a real place of almost as tranquil as that forest behind you, of just this isolation where I could focus on my writing and do it purely for myself. And so I think it was a lot about dreams that had been furloughed and something I'd always been moving towards.
That's lovely. That's a beautiful description.
Maybe
that's how it grabs all of us who end up writing.
Yeah, I found myself, I couldn't help it. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. I was kind of dragged to the desk in a way. And it wasn't that I had necessarily thoughts about it. It was that I just something I had to do.
Absolutely. Compelled, I'm sure.
Compelled is the word.
Well done. Fantastic.
Nice to meet you.
And you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarah. So the next question we have is from Phoebe Cripps, who's an alum from the Curating Contemporary Art programme for 2018. Phoebe's currently a curator of the Hayward Gallery and has written for TLS and Art Monthly and another magazine. So thanks, Phoebe.
Hi, thank you very much, and nice to meet you, Douglas. Yeah, my question is that you've mentioned feeling like an imposter when writing, especially with balancing your other career and moving between the two. So how did you overcome this feeling?
Nice to meet you, Phoebe. That's a good question. I think in truth, I don't feel that I have overcome it. I think it's something I battle with all the time. I think oftentimes working class kids that penetrate a middle class milieu or an industry, and literature is definitely middle class, publishing is an upper middle class, if that, always feels a little bit out of place. I don't meet many other working class people from a working class background within publishing, not that I've been in it very long. And so you do just feel like an imposter. And I always carried that chip around my shoulder that said, you know, English wasn't a thing that boys from the East End or the South Side of Glasgow should study because it belonged to other people. But the only way I've ever learned to cope with it is to quietly do my work. I think nothing shuts up yourself and shuts up other people than delivering work. And that's the only way I've ever known to cope with it. I try not to listen to the voice, and the voice comes from a place of hurt, I think. And so I try to be aware that I'm hurt in some way and then ignore that voice. And then I just focus on the work. And also be aware that probably a lot of people feel that way. And so we all come to a room sometimes not feeling like we belong in it. And so I don't know. I don't know if I know how to cope, but that's how I do it.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I think I only realized recently how much imposter syndrome is linked to class. And yeah. Thank you very much.
And I think we live in a society that sends us signals about it all the time. Certainly if you grew up in the 80s like I did, and you never saw yourself reflected in the media or books or, you know, anywhere else. And then suddenly you enter or you emerge into this world and you're like, oh my God, you're not prepared for it in any kind of way. And so, but you bring something unique to it and diverse to it. I didn't realize that winning the Booker was seen as a diverse thing when I won it, because I don't feel diverse to myself, right? I just feel like myself. And sure enough, I am, for a lot of things, just a fat white guy. And so the rest of it has sort of been something that I realized, even just the notion that a working class narrative wins the Booker and the British narrative is seen as this diverse thing just shows you how far we have to come.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phoebe. So the next question we have is from Unpe Lee, who's a second year women's wear student. And she's been working with painting and text and photography as well in her work. So I guess interestingly, in a similar way to you, Douglas, has sort of been moving across different areas as well. So thank you, Unpe.
Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm a second-year student from fashion. My question is, how do you think fashion graduates can use their skills and abilities in other creative activities, such as writing?
Nice to meet you. That's a great question. You know, there's things that fashion designers do that I am in deep admiration of, and I think oftentimes it's undervalued because it can seem to be very ethereal or done without much perhaps thought. It's a very emotional decision-making thing. It can be instinctual, it's certainly fast, it can be collaborative, and it's very expressive. Sometimes we have a tough time explaining why we make the decisions we make, and we just make them because it feels right. And First of all, I've come to learn that it's all right to not be able to explain what it is you're trying to do. It's okay if it just feels right, because a lot of things don't feel right. So if it feels right, it's okay. But I don't quite know. So I guess the first thing I'm saying is fashion designers have an enormous amount of strength. And so many other industries create things where the outcome or the thing that is produced at the very end is almost a version of the final product is publishing. A book is always a book. It's always printed on paper and it's always between two covers. Whereas fashion designers, in a way, have this dynamic challenge where it could almost be anything made out of any material, and that is done incredibly quickly. And so I think, you know, fashion designers can do anything they want to. At the core of it, I think, is emotion, and we're always creating worlds or trying to convince people of things. And I think that is transferable across many, many mediums. Certainly in the world of writing, and I can only maybe speak about my own experience, thinking visually has allowed me to create Shuggie Bain, because that became the unique way in which I write. I couldn't be Cormac McCarthy or Toni Morrison or someone that had spent 10 years at Cambridge, because I hadn't. And so instead, what I had done is I'd spent my entire life communicating visually and telling stories through cloth and color choices and textures and how things move across a room. And so I just leaned into that when I was writing and thinking about what people wanted to reveal about themselves and conceal about themselves. And so being able to tell stories visually always lends itself to the page. You just need to make that leap. I don't know if that answers it, Yunpei.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And good luck.
Thanks, Yunpei. Yeah, good luck. So the next question is from Sahela Balak, who's a PhD student in the School of Arts and Humanities. And Sahela's doing what sounds like an amazing PhD project called Diaspora Tapestries, Reclaiming British South Asian Identity Through Pattern. So thank you, Sahela. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Douglas. Thank you. Very nice to see you. Thanks so much for taking my question. What I wanted to ask you, Douglas, was how difficult was it finding your voice and finding the right way to tell this story?
Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you for the question. I think it's difficult in any medium, you know, especially when you're training to do something, you're given so many references and points of historical points of inspiration, whether it's in fashion or architecture or in writing. And what you almost have to do from that is find your own point of view within it. And I came from so far outside of traditional publishing circles, not coming up through an MA in writing or being even part of a writer's workshop. And the only person who read my book for a decade was my husband. He's a very smart man, but that was the only point of view I had. And what I realized is sometimes it's better to be wrong or be so singular that you can't fit in with other things. My entire career about fashion almost had too many points of reference. So I was always aware of what other people were doing and I could place myself in that at any point. Whereas when I came to writing, although I'm a big reader, I couldn't ever pitch myself or like place myself in the cosmos or the firmament of other writers. And so I just did whatever I wanted to do. And I think any creative is served well by making sure that's what they want to do. At some point, you have to push away all the other references and do the thing that can only flow from you. And that's where I got to. And also because my writing was such a personal thing, I had a hugely creative life. But I never created something that was just for me, where I could put my arms around it and never not share it if I didn't want to. Everything was about output and making and selling and making and what's new and what's the next trend. And writing for me was a very isolated place, and I loved that. And so that allowed me, I hope, to just have a focus on it.
Thank you.
Sorry, because I'm terrible at answering questions, Sahali.
No, that was great. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sahela. You're great at answering questions, Douglas. What are you on about?
My best.
We've got the next student is someone I'm very familiar with because I've just been in a crit with her all day. It's Margot Wilson, who's a writing student. Margot has was actually at the University of Glasgow as well. So she has a familiarity with Glasgow, I know. So hi Margot, nice to see you again.
Hello Jeremy, and hello Douglas. I'm delighted to be listening to you and hearing how you've gone about writing Shuggie Bain on a second reading and loving it as much the second time around. My question is, your novel's been referred to a few times here on the radio as sometimes being brutal. Do you feel that the Scottish, this acerbic wry voice is more like a kind of cutting through the guff and a gladiatorial dressing down rather than it being brutal?
Yeah, nice to meet you, Margot. I think part of the Glaswegian or the Scottish spirit is to tell things as straightforward and as blunt as possible without any pretense. And so that can be love, that can be things that sit very uncomfortably together, like violence and tenderness. And I think that is part of the Scottish nature, and certainly the Glaswegian nature is to be incredibly direct about it. I actually never think of the book as grim. It's described as many things: brutal, grim, sad. And I don't ever think about that. I just think about it as life. And life is all of those things. And especially when you're living in poverty or with addiction, or you're othered under a patriarchy or misogyny. And so it is all those things, but it's also funny, it's collective, it's tender, it's hopeful with a small h, it's lots of different things. And so it is true that I wanted to be as sort of, I never thought about who was going to read the book, or I said this earlier, but I never thought about the readers, and I didn't want to consider them, or the critic from the Times or the critic from the New York Times. I only really thought about the characters and what would be true to them. And then even in the choice of language, I wanted to make sure it was really accessible, first of all to the characters, and then to my family, and then the people I grew up around, before I thought how anyone else would pull apart my prose or my grammar or anything else. And so all of that, I hope, is just in service of telling a story as sort of plainly and as bluntly as possible.
Brilliant. Oh, it's achieved that and some.
Thank you, Margot. And good luck with the crit.
Thanks, Margot. See you tomorrow. So the next question we have is from Chris McGinley, who's a research fellow at the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. So a lot of Chris's work focuses on the role of information and empathy in research-driven design outputs. So hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, Douglas.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I was just wondering if you could outline some of the challenges that you've had to confront and overcome, both in what you've revealed about yourself, but also in the journey you've taken to where you are today.
Oh yeah, there's been a lot. So it's just you and me to the end of the hour then, Chris. I mean, I think the first thing is it was hard to grow up with a mother who was suffering with alcoholism. Hard for her, first of all, but hard as a son that was born into that and then lost her at 16. It's colored everything in my life, even as an adult man in his 40s now. And in fact, it's the love for my mother and wanting to give a voice to this situation that made me write Shuggie. But then also, you know, school was a riot between the bullying and also my mother's addiction, but also because a lot of kids were missing out on something at home or in the environment. So it was hard. You know, I went to school in East End, then I did my high school in Pollock. And, you know, I went to a high school where 250 kids started and only 12 finished to go on to higher education. And sometimes when I tell middle class or academic audiences that, they're like, oh, they can't believe it, but that was life. And so even just attaining education was tough. And then sort of going on to university, I think one of the biggest challenges was I just couldn't stop. And so there was never any opportunity for the first 20, probably about the first 15 years of my professional career, to have any self-reflection, because there was there was no reverse gear. There was no home to go to. Couldn't go back to Glasgow and spend a month on my mum's couch because there wasn't such a thing. I couldn't have a sick day at college. I couldn't not work through the summer. I couldn't go to Australia. And so it was just like all this relentless forward momentum throughout my entire early years. And so really it was only when I sort of reached the peak of my fashion career that I could stop and be like, what is it you're trying to do? Like I hadn't checked in with myself, as Americans say. It's a horrible phrase, but it's what it meant. Like, I just hadn't asked myself what I was trying to do. And that's when Shuggie started to come together, and my next book and my short stories, because I realized I was so off track that my own sort of compass, my internal compass, just had kept me relentlessly going forward in a sort of survival mode, and then not it. But then in terms of publishing Shuggie, you know, it sounds glib, and I think it's hard to say sometimes to other writers, but I had already felt like I'd won when I'd written the book, because that's all I'd wanted to achieve. And from this book that was 15 drafts or so, and the first draft was 900 pages single space, which would be a 1,600 page book if you published it. I mean, it would be this thick. That's all I'd wanted to do, was to create the work, to spend time with my craft, to spend time with my characters and in that world. And so the 32 rejections, actually, which are 44, I never tell anyone that, but actually they're creeping up, it didn't have any effect on me, because I'd still created the work I wanted, and I never altered it through the rejections. I never took anyone's feedback. I never changed it. I just kept forward with what I believed in. And that's because the work was the important thing to me. And part of that is because I was insulated, because I had a fashion career, and so I wasn't relying on my writing to make a living at the time. So that's a very privileged place to be. You have to acknowledge that. I have to acknowledge that. But also because I was making this work only for myself. But rejection's an important part of being a writer, as you know. And actually, to anyone who's writing, I'll tell you now, I'm still being rejected. The book is still being rejected around the world. There are people who don't want to publish it and don't want to take it. And you have to be all right with that. You just have to keep moving on, because you'll be rejected by editors, by agents, by magazines, by readers, by critics. you'll be rejected by everyone, but all that matters is your connection with the work. And through all that rejection, you will come to find the champions for your work, as I did with that one single editor who believed in it as much as he did. Now look at where the book is, you know. And also, it's hard to like launch a Scottish voice in America. I mean, I know I can hear your Scottish accent, but we're not seen as the most accessible of writers. And when a lot of Americans couldn't find Glasgow on a map, and that's not a dig, that's a fact. And then 80s Glasgow, what does that mean to them? You know, they underestimated the hope and the love and the connection that people could have with the book. And we do this a lot anyway, everywhere. They distilled it down to what's it about, what shelf does it sit on? And then they were like, there is no shelf for this book. It's not got, and it doesn't intersect with anything in the zeitgeist. And that was their mistake, because of course it's about love and it's about hope, and there's so many people in jeopardy and struggling with things, and we can all relate to it, I think.
Magic. Brilliant answer. A lot of familiar stuff there as well, you know.
I just gave you my bio in like 3 minutes. That is what on record.
It's perfect. And thanks very much. And you've helped me out with Christmas gifts this year. It's going to be in a lot of stockings. So thank you for that.
I wish I could sign them for you, Chris. Thank you.
Cheers.
See you later.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So now we have a question from Alex Stanek, who's an alum from the sculpture program from last year, actually, and she's the current student union co-president for Kensington. I know that Alex does a lot of work, has done a lot of work with film and writing and multimedia sort of work as well. So thanks for joining us, Alex.
Hi, lovely to meet you, Douglas.
Nice to meet you, Alex.
Hi, so my question is about taking interest in different art forms and learning from the primary source how to do it well. So it's a very practical one. What is your advice for aspiring fiction writers?
My advice is, I don't know, is entirely universal. So meaning, do take it with a pinch of salt. But these are the things that have been helpful for me. The first thing is try not to place any pressure on yourself. Or I see an awful lot of writers focus on the end goal of having a book finished or something. And you have to have an internal sort of engine that tells you are making progress and you are going to the page and you are getting on, but that can't be the driving force. The driving force has to be that you want to bring these characters, this situation or this thing to life. And you should spend as much time as that takes. Only you will really know what that is. And so you have to balance those things, but I wouldn't let the sort of the end goal override the thing you are going to do. I would also trust in the unknown. No writer comes to a page, or very few of us come to the page where we know what a book is going to be or what it's going to tell us. And Shuggie, although the mother and son didn't change, a lot of the other stuff changed, and my understanding of it was. And sometimes I found myself writing things without understanding what I was writing, or why this character popped up, or why this woman came into a room to tell me something. And so there's a subconscious at play there, and it's about having faith in yourself, and you should. And so like follow that, but allow yourself the time for those excursions. And then I find that the big advice that all writers give is read everything, and read not just the classics, but read contemporaries. I also like to think a bit of overlooked advice is to live. And that doesn't mean to say don't work, but it means if you want to write about bus drivers, maybe go drive a bus, or know what it means like a steering wheel feels like under your hands. Or if you want to write about migrants, go work on a farm for a couple of weeks. You know, make sure that not only that your understanding of the world isn't just reflections and refractions through other people's work. Make sure it's something that you know what leather smells like, and you know how hot the sun is, or you know how at 11 o'clock every day working on a farm, all you want is to go to the bathroom and have a glass of water, whatever those things are. You know, those are bad examples, but I think sometimes writers have a tough time stepping away from their desk and connecting with the thing it is they're trying to write about. And I think that will always serve you well if you can do that.
No, that's really wonderful. I really enjoy that observation about trusting the unknown. And I think it's really interesting how that comes up in different creative processes. But I think that's a really exhaustive answer. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Thank you, Alex. We actually have time for me to read out a question from somebody who I'm afraid isn't able to join us on screen. So I'm going to have to read it out for you. But it's Danielle Barrios O'Neill. And her question was, I'm just reading it out, how did your experience working alongside and with artists in other fields shape your writing, especially in terms of process?
Actually, in a very blunt way, in terms of we spoke about my visual language, and I didn't necessarily have all the skills with English to create the story in the way I thought stories should be written by all the books I read. And so instead, I really relied on my visual language. But also being able to, taking my time with it was really important. A lot of how I had to write on a very practical daily basis was I might only get 30 minutes in the morning, or I might not get to write for 3 weeks, or I would get 14-hour flights to China and like love them because I'd spend 14 hours writing. None of my team could reach me. Every summer holiday, you know, I would ruin it from my husband's point of view because we would go somewhere and all I would do was write. And that's all I wanted to do. And he allowed me to do that. But the point about that is again, I think sometimes we think time at the page is the only way to write. And I was always carrying the characters with me. I was always running dialogue through my mind. I was taking notes in a sketchbook. But sometimes you do a lot of writing away from the page. You're just thinking, you're absorbing, you're processing. You should always be sort of like turning around these scenes in your mind and how are you really going to come at it? And so what actually was a weakness for me or a real life concern, I tried to turn into a strength. And it allowed me to keep coming back with a little bit of clarity to the page and to the situation, which I think ultimately I appreciated. And so that was one of my biggest things.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, maybe I could just ask you, expand on that a little more, because I think it's very interesting. Obviously, you know, during this period you were writing, you're working within fashion, which is famously a sort of quick turnover and very seasonal sort of process and industry. And how did you manage to maintain it? It feels like two very different relationships with time in a way, where you've got something which is very quick turnover and is seen as you said earlier, seen as being ephemeral and in a sense sort of throwaway, and then something else which you're working on for 10 years. How did you sort of keep those two relationships going?
I think my disappointment in one drove me to the other, because I actually was a bit exhausted by the ephemeral nature of fashion, to be honest. Fashion eats its own children. It's almost in a way a constant prototyping stage, because you're always making something, then making another version of it, and then making another. And so in a way and it's not meant to endure, most of it. I mean, we'd like it if it endured more, but how consumers treat clothing and they want the next thing and they want to keep expressing themselves means it doesn't relate. But it's also a very instinctual business. You don't get much time to think about it, and especially in large brands, you know, you're expected to really every single day you're performing and you're doing it. But it's incredibly collaborative too, meaning as soon as you sketch something or as soon as you think up something or you have a couple of words, somebody reacts to it and they make the dress that goes with the blouse that you made, or you know, and you're doing it in that way. And so in a funny way, I was reacting against that, because writing then on the other side, you're right, is a totally different relationship with time. There is no rush, there is no hurry, there is no sharing if you don't want there to be. And many writers share and allow their spouses or their writing friends to read every page they write. That'll never be who I am as a writer. And so I like that sort of, it's a very rare thing to have creativity, but have it only for yourself. And we shouldn't ever undervalue that, because there's very little in life, creative or otherwise, that we are not obliged to share with people immediately, even holiday photos or photos of your dinner or like what you thought of a movie. And so be all right with like the quietness and the isolation of writing, because it's really a gift. But then I'm working on my third novel now. My second novel is already finished, Jeremy. And I wrote my second novel when I had stepped away from fashion. I began it before I stepped away, but I really sort of polished it in there. And so all three of my books have come out with different relationships to time too. Shuggie had to work around. I was like a working mom or a working dad, and Shuggie got my attention when I could come home. And then my next book sort of was very forthright and very demanding of me. And it was about a lot of days, a lot of hours at the table. And now this third book is trying to be a blend of both, where it's asking me to step away a little bit and take my time again and do that. And so I think flexibility with time is important to writing, or it's important to me.
Thank you. I'm going to keep asking you questions until I get kicked off the screen, I'm afraid. Because I've got lots of things I'd like to ask you. I guess one other thing, and I mean, when I was reading it, obviously I was reading it knowing your sort of fashion background, and I couldn't help but be reminded of it, obviously, at points. And there was one particular scene when Agnes is taken to the sort of country and western type club by Eugene, and I can't remember the name of the character now, I'm afraid, but there's a woman who is obviously checking out her clothes, and you have this great line about she was paying attention to the details of things and knew what was meant by them, and I sort of there's lots of detail in your piece, and even in your answer then just to Alex, you were talking about, you know, what's the smell of leather, how does the sun feel on your body, these sorts of things. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that sort of very the texture of things, which seems so important in the book.
Yeah, I wonder if some of that comes, well, part of it comes from being a watchful child. When you are enthralled to a parent who's suffering with alcoholism, you become their caregiver. Often, sometimes their best friend, whatever you want to say, but you're always sort of watching the weather in the room. And so as a kid, I was incredibly lonely and isolated, but it made me incredibly observant, and observant with like a front row seat into an adult's world. I got to see things that children just shouldn't see. And then maybe that compounds with like the micro work of textiles and the really fine detail work there, but always thinking about textures, how things feel, how they go together, how they contrast each other. But again, just, you know, the first couple of chapters I wrote for the book were an absolute failure because I was trying to be a writer. I was too busy like trying to step into the performative, or what I thought was how writers were and how they approached the page. And then when I dismantled that, or I just broke down and sort of gave in, and I approached the page how I would and sort of noticed these things. And you're right, there's this barmaid that notices she has a little bit of a thing for this man who is at a country and western club, but his attention's focused on another woman. And she has noticed that his shirt is ironed and that his shoes are polished and all these things. And she knows instantly there's a woman in his life. And she knows that. And that, I think, just comes from close observation. And fashion text tells you that as well. You know, we're always sort of fascinated by small deviations in detail because it is very repetitive. You know, we're always referencing history, but then the very smallest tweak or the slightest change to that has a whole new meaning or a new context. And so that's a skill that I brought from the Royal as well.
Which I guess maybe my final question should be: do you have a strong memory of the Royal College? You said it was interesting to see the Darwin over Paul's shoulder earlier on. What's your sort of fondest memory of being at the Royal College?
Well, I loved it. I mean, I think the fondest memory is it's one of the really few times in your life you will be around such a concentration of people who are at the peak of their careers or just about to be at the peak of their careers. And from coming from an undergraduate to ending up at the Royal, when it's not only the best of the best, but then also people who are so serious about advancing whatever medium they're in, and they're so focused on that, is really a gift. I mean, do try and lift your head and look around and make connections and savor it, because to be honest, I didn't do enough of that. I was so shook, and then I was so like driven by work that much of it flew by. And now looking back 20 years later, I wish I'd like savored it a little bit more, because it's really rare. You'll never be around that many creatives in your life, multidisciplinary, but also people that you don't know where they're going to go in life and what they're going to achieve. And so make as many connections as you can and lift your head and enjoy it, because I didn't do enough of that.
That's great advice. It's what I tell my students all the time.
Oh, really?
It goes incredibly quickly. It's very intense and very quick, but really a wonderful period. I think you're completely right.
Yeah, and you can have your blinkers on a little bit. I was just head down the whole time and focused on what I was trying to say, and I wish I'd sort of done a little less of that.
Well, you can come back and
I will.
thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder what it is about fashion at the RCA that I mean, they are the last to leave the building, and they often say what you've just said, which is, I wish I had. I mean, it is such a singular pursuit, and so many of them are just ploughing this very, very deep singular furrow. Of course, the other kind of real giveaway that you just said is talking about the Royal, because it's only the fashion students who call it the Royal.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Nobody else ever says just the Royal. Everyone else calls it the College, but fashion always calls it the Royal. And I think it predates Wendy as well. But Wendy certainly always used to call it just the Royal.
Oh, yeah. I've never called it anything else. And I've always called it the Royal. But it's funny because fashion, I don't know why we're so immersive. I think we have, Jeremy's question about time is going to make me think about time for the next 3 weeks. But I mean, fashion in a way is trying to build something while the world is revolving the fastest underneath it, because it's always too late and it's always going to go somewhere else. And so there's a little bit of that sort of chaotic energy that fashion designers have, where they feel like they're always trying to catch up and they're always trying to do the next and the new thing. It doesn't, the world is just at a slightly different pace there, I think. And also because our stuff is ephemeral and it's going to be blown away for the most part. There's that, but yeah. But it was so fun. We ran amok on the 8th floor when I was there. It was our little kingdom. It was such a brilliant time.
Well, your answers are just incredibly generous, so thoughtful. I thought all of your responses were just so insightful and just reveal an incredibly modest individual, which is all the more impressive. It's really been an absolute pleasure reading your book, meeting you, and hearing you speak with our students so thoughtfully. We're going to ask you now to give us a second reading from the book. Again, it's your choice of a passage, just to give us a final flavour.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. This passage actually comes from just beyond the midway point in the book. Agnes, after suffering after being abandoned by her husband, a very bad man, has suffered through some years of up and down with her addiction, and she has fallen in love again. She's met a man who emerges on the scene almost like a hero, almost like an archetypal knight in a black Hackney taxi, and she's asked her youngest son Shuggie to teach her how to dance because she feels so out of time having been a single mother all this time. And so Shuggie is going to teach his mother how to dance, but remember, he has been dealing with being othered by the community around him for thinking he's queer or too effeminate. He was enjoying her attention. Something inside him flowered, and he started popping his body like he'd seen the black boys on telly do. The self-consciousness left him, and he spun and shimmied and shook in all the telly ways. He was mid-cat sleep when he let out a sharp scream. It was high-pitched and womanly, the same shriek he let loose when Leek leapt out of the dark at him. Shuggie stood with his fingers outstretched, frozen in time. He hadn't seen them at first, and he would never know how long they had been there. But across the street, in the window of the front room, stood the McAvenis. They pressed against the large glass window, and they were gutting themselves with laughter. The window throbbed as they beat their hands against it with glee. Dirty Mouse did a little sexy girlish pirouette, and Shuggie realized that was him. He looked at his mother. When had she noticed? She only looked up at him and took a draw on her fag. Without looking out the window, she spoke through clenched teeth. If I were you, I would keep dancing. I can't. The tears were coming. You know they only win if you let them. I can't. His arms and his fingers were still outstretched and frozen like a dead tree. Don't give them the satisfaction. Mammy, help, I can't. Yes, you can. She was still smiling. Just hold your head up high and gie it laldy. She was no use at maths homework, and some days you could starve rather than get a hot meal from her. But Shuggie looked at her now and understood this is where she excelled. Every day, with the makeup on and her hair done, she climbed out of her grave and held her head high. When she had disgraced herself with drink, she got up the next day, put on her best coat and faced the world. When her belly was empty and her veins were hungry, she did her hair and let the world think otherwise. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You've been doing so many of these interviews, I'm sure, and it's really generous of you to phone in and allow us to spend some time with you. Thank you very, very much indeed. I know everybody at the RCA is incredibly proud of you and in full of admiration. And we just can't wait to get our hands on Loch Or when do you think it'll be published?
I think hopefully we're going to announce it in the next couple of weeks, or maybe right after Christmas. But I'm hearing on the grapevine spring of 2022.
Great. Well, as Chris McGinley said, I mean, there's so many people joking at the RCA, including the IT guy who helped me with the computer today. Everyone said, "Oh yeah, I'm getting that for my girlfriend. Well, I'm getting that for my boyfriend." So it's going to be the RCA Christmas present. So thanks so much, and it's been really lovely to meet you. And Jeremy, thank you too for your really wonderful and very, very thoughtful questions. It's great to have you both. So bye bye. Have a happy Christmas.
Yeah, thank you for having me.